for attending another one of these webinars. We can see a few familiar faces around here. I'm going to allow the audience to introduce themselves, the panel to introduce themselves, sorry, throughout the presentation, whenever their slides come on. And then we've got a Q&A and a chat section as well. As I've said before, this webinar is being recorded, and there will be a follow-up package sent to everybody who's registered. The reason why we're hosting a webinar in FuelEU Maritime is due to popular demand from our members. Our members have asked to see more information, more clarity, and more guidance on this subject. So here we go. You will see a little bit of repetition throughout the slides. That's intentional. Some of these acronyms and terms that are used are new to some of you. So we believe that if we put it more than once, then it will, you'll get to see it a little bit more and become more familiar with it throughout the presentation. There will also be a little bit of overlap between presenters, which is also intentional. As we say, it's quite a complicated subject and it's new to some of you. So the intention really is to give you as much information as possible. So without further ado, let's get going onto the presentation and some of the technical and material. So a lot of these slides are for reference as well. Some of you who've attended these webinars before have seen them, so I'm not going to spend a huge amount of time on them. But let's start by looking at the Fit for 55, which are EU policies to reduce greenhouse gas emissions by at least 55% by 2030 compared to 1990. And the two that we really focus on now is EU ETS and FuelEU Maritime. The EU ETS is the previous webinar we've carried out guidance on, and the FuelEU Maritime is really what we're looking at now. But let's have a quick glance at what the differences are. So the differences between EU ETS, the EU ETS is an extension of emissions trading scheme to maritime. It's a polluters pays principle, and it promotes energy savings, efficiency, and energy transition. It's important to note that it's from tank to wake, whereas the FuelEU Maritime is from well to wake. And we'll go through that in a slide a little bit later on. But I think a lot of you repeat attendees of our webinars will understand well to wake and tank to wake. But I'll touch on it very lightly as we go through the next section. It's to promote renewable and low carbon fuels in maritime transport. And really the headline that we want to bring forward now is the deadline of the 31st of August, which is only 66 days away from today. So that's the deadline of the FuelEU monitoring plan to the verifier. And then you have to start monitoring on the 1st of January 2025. Let's have a quick look at this timeline. So the timeline here we've got on the 31st of August 2024 is the monitoring plan to the verifier, as we've discussed. On the 1st of January 2025, the monitoring starts. And then in 1st of January 2026, the FuelEU report is submitted to the verifier. Thereafter, the company will include pool vessels from March 2026 and calculate the advanced compliance. With the 30th of June 2026, payment of possible remedial penalties retrospectively to the administrating authority. You will see the verifier timelines along the bottom here, and then you will also see them combined together. We're going to leave that there for reference material. We're not going to spend too much time on it because we've got quite a lot of material to get through. Is anybody else having a problem with the slides being too small, or is it just the one person reporting, please? Okay, I'll just continue for the moment. If anybody else has any problems with the slides, please let me know. Perhaps if you click on the slide itself, it will magnify it. It may just be the way you've got your PowerPoint set up. Thank you. So the next slide we're going to look at is very quickly is the well to wake analysis. And as we all know, when we look at the tank to wake, we're looking on this small portion of the equation. When we're looking at well to wake, we're taking into consideration everything throughout the whole process, including the tractors and the technology used to produce the renewable electricity at this point. So that's really looking at the whole process as opposed to one part in isolation. This is for your reference material. It's something that Edwin produced, who will be talking later on throughout the presentation. And it just shows you what really in green is relevant to the FuelEU Maritime and in red, some of the other energy saving equipment, which isn't so relevant. But like I say, we haven't got much time to go through this in detail. We're going to put that there as background information and reference material for the follow-up package. So just really going back on what we said before there, FuelEU Maritime focuses on fuel and uptake of renewable and low carbon fuels, and its technology neutral approach, use of zero and low carbon fuels as opposed to specific technology. Pardon me, the targeted reduction, there's a percentage target reduction for yearly average GHG intensity of the energy used on board. And that starts at 2025 with a 2% reduction, the baseline being 91.16 grams per CO2. This is then obviously reduced by 6, 14.5, and right the way through to an 80% reduction, which then in 2050, which then brings the figure down to 18.23 grams per CO2 megajoules. So that's quite a significant reduction we need to see by 2050. So there's obviously quite a bit of work to get there, and this is a method to do so. So then we look at the scope of it. It ships above 5,000 gross tons, intra-EU traffic in completion, or 50% of international EU ports. And that's something we'll discuss as we go throughout this presentation. As we said before, it's well to wake, so it's looking at the whole process, not just isolated parts of the process. Its inclusion of CO2, methane, and nitrous oxide on a complete well-to-tank basis. And its flexibility mechanism via banking or borrowing surpluses and deficits, which can be carried over to the next year. We'll go through that in a little bit more detail later. And then the important thing is the non-compliance leads to a penalty. And some of the test cases we've done on this show that in the majority of cases, we can't talk for all here because every circumstance is individual, but the majority of cases, you're talking some quite hefty fines for non-compliance. So it really is worth concentrating on this. The next thing we're going to look at is RF and NBO, because you're going to see this term used a lot. We just want to give you a little bit of a description of it and what it's about. So RF NBO is a renewable fuel from a non-biological origin. It's a renewable liquid or gaseous transport fuel for which none of the energy content of the fuel comes from biological sources. On the left-hand side of this diagram here, we look at the EU Commission, which will monitor the FuelEU database. And if the share in maritime fuel mix is less than 1% in 2031, then the new sub-target will be 2% starting in 2034. So that's going to ramp up the non-biological renewable fuels. And there's various red directives and articles, red standing for Renewable Energy Directive, something else you'll see a lot more of. Then we just quickly, before I go on to the next section, we quickly look at the GHG fuel certification. And what you can see here is if we look at it in entirety, basically we've got the red certification. So we've got renewable and biomass, low carbon and synthetic fuels, RF, NBO, and biofuels, which basically relates to all of the required GHG fuel certification for the Renewable Energy Directive. However, in top of that, because we're looking at it from a well to wake, you need to consider distribution, blending, and bunkering for the FuelEU Maritime. Some of the points here are just raised just for to raise to your information. So GHG fuel certification is a level playing field. That's the idea. The fuel certificate to be submitted with the bunker delivery note, and it needs to include greenhouse gases savings for each fuel product supply. Book and claim is not possible under FuelEU. That's something that Alexander and Ruben may talk about later on throughout the presentation. And fuel certification outside the EU is with other certification schemes needs to be focused on, so we get the certification right. And we have had some feedback from some members on some flag states which are not giving the sustainable information this. I'm hoping Edwin, who's going to follow me in the next couple of slides, can sort of follow on from that and give you a little bit more information and the timelines and what's going on in the background, because Edwin has a lot of first-hand experience in this area. But just before we go on to that, I just really want to show you the sustainable certification process, the importance of it and really how it functions. So on the left-hand side here, we can see that we've got bunker operators, and it's important to have evidence of proof of sustainability, and it must be sent to the ship with the quantity supplied. The bunker operators need to be registered with the union database and will need to provide fuel certificates and bunker delivery notes, receipts to verifiers, as well as proof of sustainability for fractions received. And they also need to register as recipients of the fuel and have proof of sustainability. With the verifiers checking compliance of ships, companies for proof of sustainability, receipts, and it's reported under TETIS MRV and the FuelEU database. With that, I'd like to say thank you, and I'm going to hand over to Edwin for the next couple of slides before Edwin hands on to Alexander. Thanks, Edwin. Thank you.
Thanks, Mark. Let me just take control, and I'll see if I can try to demystify some of the things that are going on. You might be wondering, there seems to be a lot that's unknown or uncertain about FuelEU to this point, and you'd be right. And here is the list of implementing acts and delegated acts, which are meant to be published, but that many of them aren't actually ready yet. And things are running a little bit behind schedule. I forgot to mention, I'm Edwin. I run a small consultancy called Arcsilea, and we've been involved with a lot of regulatory policy work at the IMO and with the Commission, and we've assisted the Commission a little bit with FuelEU in the background. So the issue here is that some of these things which were promised for end of last year are delayed. And particularly, if you look here, the ones highlighted in blue, so information about OPS, the definition of the standard monitoring plan, which is due by the 31st of August, rules for verification, rules for the FuelEU database. A lot of these are kind of running a little bit late. Now, particularly for the monitoring plan, which is the one that's most imminent, we understand that the sort of final version of this template monitoring plan will be available in the first week of July. We think that's what we've heard, and that's what we understood. So if you've been frustrated with your monitoring plan that's not being accepted by class, or because it's not final and so on, the end is hopefully in sight quite soon. Couple of other things just to bear in mind. There will be some EU guidelines on GHG marine fuel certification, which will make clear a lot of the sort of issues with fuel certification, or just to make some of these things a bit more transparent and obvious, because it's there is quite a lot that has to go into the certification piece in order to for this to kind of work. And then just very importantly to note that the methodology for calculation of the GHG intensity for RFNBOs won't be finalized until the end of 2024. So if you're ordering RFNBOs, or you're attempting to order RFNBOs, this is e-fuels for those of you who don't know the acronyms, then this is going to, you're not going to be totally sure what the GHG intensity of this is until the end of the year, when the methodology and the calculation methodology will be finalized. So for now, the parts that are certain are around biofuels, and RFNBOs will unfortunately have to come a little bit later. So I think the message is, don't panic, don't worry. It is unclear. Everyone is on the regulatory policy side is aware that things are unclear, but things will become clearer as time goes on. It will be a bit late, but just bear with it, and we'll all get there in the end. Now, there are some other policy details that might be useful. So one is, there may be some worked examples provided by the Commission to help clarify some aspects of the regulation. And one of these areas, which is a little bit unclear at the moment, is this concerns treatment of lower carbon fuels on extra EU voyages where only 50% of the energy is in scope. Now, there is the possibility, this was discussed, that actually all of the biofuel could be allocated to the 50% energy. Because if you don't do this allocation, what you'll end up with is that, in effect, you get half the benefit of the biofuel on an extra EU voyage. And that's not really, I think, how it's intended to work. However, it's a bit, this is a fix that we think might come into effect, but it will only be reported once these examples or once further clarification comes out. So on that one, again, we're sort of waiting to hear what the final version is going to be like. That's it from me, I think, and I'm happy to answer any questions later. So I'm going to hand over to Alex.
I think the slides have just dropped off. Can we see the slides still?
I'm just getting them back up, I think. Yeah.
Thank you. Well, hi, everyone. I'm Alexandra Veroda, and I'm from Environmental Commodities Trader, STX. I'm a maritime-focused sectoral analyst, and today I am joined with my colleague, Ruben Tins, who is a business development director within the biofuel teams. So as we have been discussing, the FuelEU Maritime has a gradual phase-in its initial stages of its implementation. In the initial stage, we have a 2% reduction from the 91.16 grams of CO2 per megajoule baseline. And as you can see, this ramps up rapidly, in particular once we get to 2035, where we have a 14.5% reduction. However, even in its early stages, which is highlighted here by the teal bar, most operators using conventional marine fuels will need to immediately assess their options to reduce emissions. And this can include many LNG vessels where methane slip can push emissions over the limit, but will really depend on the specific engine used. But even for compliant vessels, the regulation will still have influence, as I will discuss. But firstly, let's discuss the penalty, which is really not something to ignore. So the FuelEU Maritime penalty is set at 2,400 euros per tonne of VSFLO equivalent, which is around 640 euros per tonne of CO2. And this grows for consecutive years of non-compliance. And this is really in stark contrast to a complementary piece of regulation, the ETS, which, as you know, has been phased in from this year. The EUA price, which is currently around 70 euros, which you can see on this left-hand side chart, the bar there, is not acting as the stick to force change. However, the FuelEU Maritime penalty is significantly above a range of different biofuel abatement costs, which we've highlighted there in the middle bar. And this can range from anywhere between 500 to 200 euros per tonne of CO2, but these are all well below the penalty. The exact price will depend on the precise fuel used, the bunkering locations, and the CI level. But here on the right-hand side, we've broken out some of these different types of biofuels, Eucami, HVO, bio-LNG, and e-LNG as well. But interestingly, given what Mark was saying before about the well-to-wake calculation of emissions in the FuelEU Maritime, this life cycle approach can see manure-based biomethane fuels, such as bio-LNG, achieve a negative emissions factor. And this can be an extremely competitive option, even against an RFMBO-based fuel, which receives a 2x multiplier to incentivize its take-up. So this is here given by the bio-LNG with the negative 100 CI level. But blending biofuels or paying the penalty are not the only two options. There are other options within the regulation, which one of my other colleagues has previously referred to as beautiful, given its promotion of efficiency and economies of scale. And as a trained economist, I must say I have to agree. So in addition, we have the, let me use the laser here, we have the banking and borrowing mechanism. The banking mechanism allows companies that have reduced their GHG emissions by more than the threshold, they're able to save them for future compliance needs. And importantly here, there is no expiration. But the borrowing mechanism allows companies to use a portion of their anticipated surpluses from future years to comply with their current year's target. However, much like a bank, an interest rate at a bank, there is a 10% penalty that will be applied to your compliance balance and added to the following year. However, these two options can allow greater flexibility than simply paying the penalty and can help perhaps smooth over periods when there's temporary price volatility. But the real beauty lies in the pooling mechanism, which I will now discuss further. So the FuelEU Maritime Regulation is not strictly enforced to an individual vessel, but to a broader fleet or pool of vessels. Therefore, not every individual vessel within a ship's fleet needs to be operating at or below the GHG emission threshold. Those vessels with emissions below the threshold are able to share these savings with vessels below the above the threshold. And as I mentioned earlier, those are vessels with the latest LNG engines. In the initial phase of their regulation, they could in fact cover enough reductions to cover 6 traditional VSFLO vessels when operating on 100% LNG. But interestingly, when we now look at the bioblending, if I click here, if we look at a B30 biodiesel blend into VSFLO, this could cover up to 10 VSFLO vessels. And now when we look at bio-LNG with the negative 100 CI level, as I introduced earlier, using a manure-based biomethane, a 30% blend into LNG could cover up to 30 conventional VSFLO vessels. But what's more, the European Commission has not restricted the ability to spread these excess emission savings across vessels to the one company, but able to share these with numerous vessels again across different companies. So under this mechanism, the European Commission recognises that not all ship owners have a willingness or ability to access alternative fuel-capable engines, or have tested their engines for the operation of alternative fuels. Not all ship owners are able to change their operations or logistics or have the ability to access alternative fuels in the locations that they bunker. But pooling allows these vessel owners to gain exposure to the effectiveness of bunkering alternative fuels and bio-LNG if they don't operate an LNG vessel. And what's more, those that have this flexibility, who are able to access alternative fuels, have been leaders in investing in their fleet, they're able to monetize this green premium in a mutually beneficial outcome for the entire fleet. Over-compliant vessels, they are able to cover the cost of bunkering alternative fuels by creating a pool with those that are non-compliant. And those non-compliant vessels would be likely to pay a fee to access the pool. The European Commission, however, has not opted to create a government-run marketplace for pooling, instead allowing players to establish their own pooling arrangements and prices, and pools can change between compliance years. However, given the OTC nature of this pool creation, some price discovery will need to occur. But we can assume that the price of these pools could trade up to the maximum penalty and a minimum up to cover the cost of abatement. But the pooling price will need to incentivize those surplus owners to give up this surplus from a current year's pool rather than bank it and for this surplus for their own future use. And at STX, we're willing to play a role in helping ship owners optimize their FuelEU Maritime strategy, unlock this opportunity through pooling, and really minimize the penalties that need to be paid, and thereby all assisting the maritime industry in its decarbonisation journey in the most efficient and effective manner. Sarah, Helen, now over to you.
Thanks very much, Alexandra. and good morning to everybody. For those who don't know me, I'm Helen Barden. I'm a senior solicitor in our external affairs team. Now, I'm going to start looking at the FuelEU Maritime regulations and the contractual context. We'll have a look at who the company is, which voyages are caught by the regulations, and what the penalties are. And after that, I'm going to pass over to Sarah, who will look in more detail at some of the other elements that need to be considered as between owners and charterers, or owners and ship managers, and also the fuel supplier. So, unlike with the EU ETS legislation, which has a sort of fallback position, if you like, where there's no express clause agreed in a contract, it has Article 3GC, in which seeks to impose an obligation on member states to implement measures that allow the shipping company to recover costs. There is no similar fallback mechanism in the FuelEU regulations. So it's even more important to make sure that these regulations are properly addressed in a contractual context. So first of all, just looking at who the company is, so who is the responsible entity under the regulation. And Article 3 of the regulation sets this out and says that the company means the ship owner or any other organisation or person, such as the manager or the bareboat charterer, which has assumed the responsibility for the operation of the ship from the ship owner and has agreed to take over all duties and responsibilities imposed by the International Management Code for the safe operation of ships and for pollution prevention. Unlike with the EU ETS legislation, which brought in the implementing regulation to clarify that the default responsibility sat with the registered owner, and it was only where that registered owner then mandated the responsibility down to the ship manager or other entity that is the DOC holder, that the responsibility would move to them. With this regulation, at present, there is no such implementing regulation or change to that position. So the default position under it is that the DOC holder is a responsible entity, and that will often be the ship manager. Of course, the ship manager often sits at a distance from the decisions made in terms of the stemming of the fuel by charterers, for example. And so the fact that the ultimate compliance sits with the ship manager doesn't sit particularly comfortably in terms of the existing contractual expectations. And that's something that Sarah's going to look at in more detail shortly. But just turning to the scope of the voyages caught by the FuelEU regulation, and Mark briefly mentioned this before, but the wording of the FuelEU regulation is similar to the EU ETS legislation in this regard, albeit something that Edwin touched upon before was actually the difficulty in using the EU ETS approach of 50% application to extra EU voyages in this FuelEU context, because of the fact that you may not get full benefit of the use of biofuels, and that's something that hopefully will come to be addressed. So the FuelEU Maritime will apply to 100% of energy used by a vessel during its stay within an EU port, 100% of energy used on voyages from one EU port to another EU port, and 50% of energy used on voyages from an EU port of call to a non-EU port of call, and vice versa. So, as mentioned, the definition of port of call and voyage is the same as it is for the EU ETS. So it's going to be a port of call if cargo is loaded or unloaded, or if passengers are embarked or disembarked. And excluded from that definition is the likes of bunkering stops, stops for crew change, dry docking, repairs, stops at neighbouring container transshipment ports. And in respect of the neighbouring container transshipment ports, as mentioned in Edwin's slide, that's something that the European Commission will be looking to adopt implementing act on by the end of next year to establish a list of those ports. So I'm just going to jump to this slide, which will look familiar to those who attended the EU ETS webinar. But here we've got the NS decarbonisation, which loads cargo at Jebel Ali, but shortly after departing, she experiences engine problems and has to deviate to Jeddah for repairs. Following the repairs being carried out, the vessel continues on the voyage and discharges some cargo at Tangier before then going to Rotterdam to discharge the remaining cargo and ballasting to New York. Now, if the vessel is a bulk carrier, for example, unlike in the picture, the relevant ports will be the port of Tangier to Rotterdam and Rotterdam to New York. And that's because those are the ports where the cargo operations are being carried out immediately before the EU, at the EU, and then after the EU call. However, if the ship is a container ship, then the voyage call will actually be the full Jebel Ali to Rotterdam and then Rotterdam to New York. And that's because Jeddah is going to be excluded from the definition of port of call because it's a stop for repairs, not for cargo operations. And also Tangier, if we assume that Tangier is going to appear on the list of neighbouring container transshipment ports, as it is for the EU ETS, will be excluded too. So either way, for either of those scenarios, because it's an extra EU voyage into the EU and then out of the EU, we're going to be looking at 50% of the energy used on the voyage, not 100%, apart from the vessel's actual stay in Rotterdam. As Alexandra's already mentioned, there are obviously going to be different ways to manage compliance under the FuelEU, and owners will be looking at various strategies for compliance, whether it's use of biofuels, pooling, banking and borrowing, or a combination. But I just wanted to, if Mark can, if he could just kind of chip in here with comments around switching fuels during a voyage, for example, switching from VLSFO to biofuel and the kind of operational concerns or considerations that should be borne in mind. Mark?
Okay, thanks a lot, Helen. I mean, yeah, it's quite a new space we're heading into and a new era, really, when we're looking at combining and blending these fuels and such in some cases. It's something, obviously, we are nervous about. Obviously, we've seen in the past when the transition from high sulfur fuel oil to very low sulfur fuel oil, when tank cleaning, pipe cleaning and system cleaning wasn't carried out, we experienced some problems with some members there. You know, so it is something we suggested caution is placed against. It really depends on the design of your vessel and the settling tank and the piping arrangement of your vessel, whether you can segregate one tank of biofuel without perhaps having to blend it with other fuels on board. And as you know, some people have discussed in the industry, the blending of very low sulfur fuel oil and some biofuels of a better quality, you know, B100s and the like, may not cause so many concerns. We would still, you know, err on the side of caution from a compatibility perspective. And you know, we think it's something you should at least consider and discuss with your fuel testing. Come and discuss with us as well. You know, we're happy to help and happy to guide on that. But what we do want to see is this involving claims at a later stage and causing potential outage for vessels. Thank you, Helen.
Thanks very much, Mark. And just before I pass over to Sarah, I'm just going to briefly mention the penalties which have been touched upon, but it's probably correct to say that in terms of the penalty, it's not really a penalty for non-compliance, but it's rather a penalty to be paid in the event of a compliance deficit. So it's a means of compliance, perhaps, rather than saying it's paid in the event of non-compliance, because paying it will allow for the giving of that FuelEU document of compliance. That said, as you've heard from Alexandra, in most circumstances, payment of the penalty is most likely to be the most expensive means of compliance. should a shipping company fail to comply for 2 or more consecutive years, then the penalty factor increases. There's also financial penalties in relation to contraventions as regards the onshore power supply requirements. And in addition, if there is a failure to present a FuelEU document of compliance for 2 or more consecutive reporting periods, then a ship could be, in theory, banned from EU ports. And with that, I will pass you on to Sarah to look in more detail at charter party and contractual considerations. Thank you.
Thanks, Helen. So just to briefly introduce myself, my name's Sarah McCann and I'm a senior solicitor at North Standard handling FD&D claims. So as Helen said, I'm going to spend the next few minutes speaking to the contractual side. Helen's already talked about the entity who's responsible for compliance under the regulations themselves. So it's therefore very much going to be down to the parties to agree between themselves and within their contracts how the cost and also the responsibility for compliance with FuelEU Maritime is to be apportioned. So it's imperative, therefore, that ship owners, charterers and ship managers start thinking now about the contractual implications of FuelEU Maritime. So this means considering the terms of existing charter parties, ship management agreements and supply contracts, which will be continuing into 2025, alongside any new contracts which are being entered into. So just in respect of the things which need to be considered contractually by the parties in respect of compliance with FuelEU Maritime, you'll see on this slide several things there which I'm going to talk to in a bit more detail. Firstly, there's the greenhouse gas energy intensity of the fuel that's being supplied to the vessel. So in the context of a time charter party, from an owner's perspective, they're likely going to want to ensure that the relevant clause or clauses in the charter party provide an obligation on the charterers to ensure that the fuel that's being supplied to the vessel will not lead to the vessel exceeding its greenhouse gas energy intensity limit. So consideration is going to need to be had as to which fuels can be safely used on board, and the parties will also need to agree on fuel specification, testing and liability regime, and this should all be clearly set out within the terms of the charter party. Consideration will also be needed as to how any fuel burned during periods of off-hire should be dealt with in a time charter. Moving on now to compliance with the monitoring, reporting and verification requirements. In this respect, a charter is likely going to want some wording within the charter party that it's the owners or the ship managers, if it's going to be the ship managers, who will be complying with the regulations and meeting all of the monitoring, reporting and verification requirements. Charterers will probably also want to see an obligation in there that owners are to share with them any data that may assist the charterers with their own monitoring of the vessel's compliance in order that the charterers can meet their obligations under the charter party. Where it's a ship manager or a bareboat charterer who's going to be the entity responsible for compliance, then the ship owners will obviously be wanting some wording in either the bareboat charter party or the ship management agreement, setting out that it's going to be the bareboat charterer or the ship manager who's responsible for compliance with FuelEU Maritime. From an owner's or ship manager's perspective, you're also going to need to think about obtaining data and information from a charterer or whoever it is who's providing fuel to the vessel. And you'll be wanting this data not only in a timely manner, but also for this information and data to be accurate and compliant with the regulations. So this will include provision in respect of proof of sustainability documentation or certification, which Edwin spoke about earlier, and also what information is to be included in a bunker delivery note. So that leads us on to thinking a bit more about bunker supply contracts as well, because it's going to be really important that for the parties who are responsible for purchasing the fuel for the vessel to ensure that the requisite information and documentation is obtained from the bunker suppliers so that this can be then, excuse me, passed on to the verifiers as evidence of the fuel which has been stemmed. And this is important because that's in order that the correct greenhouse gas energy intensity can be calculated. So in respect of the cost of compliance with FuelEU Maritime, or in other words, the payment of the penalty in order to obtain the FuelEU document of compliance, should there be a compliance deficit, owners will no doubt be wanting to pass the costs of any penalty down the charter party chain. In the context of a time charter party, clear provision will therefore be needed as to liability for FuelEU penalties and/or expulsion or detention orders. However, as penalties are based on yearly limits and will not actually fall due until the June of the following year, the situation will be more complicated if charterers only have the vessel on charter for part of a year, or if the charter period spans more than one reporting period. So in that instance, as parties are going to more than likely want to work out a way of estimating or calculating an apportionment of penalties. One way of doing this may be for FuelEU compliance to be monitored throughout the charter period, with an obligation on charterers in the charter party to pay to the owners any calculated or estimated FuelEU penalty costs, either upon redelivery or at the end of the calendar year, and at redelivery should the charter span more than one reporting period. Doing that should hopefully help reduce any credit risk on the part of owners, as they're at least recovering the likely penalty exposure at the end of each reporting year or at the end of each charter. In respect of a voyage charter, on the other hand, obviously a time charter or owner's perspective, they're going to want to pass on the cost of compliance as well down the chain. The most likely way of doing this will be either an increased freight rate, taking into account, for example, additional fuel costs, or where the cost of compliance has been chosen to be payment of the penalty itself, then it may be that you see an express clause being agreed within a voyage charter, either by way of a surcharge or another way of dealing expressly in the charter party. So thinking a bit more about pooling, which Alexandra spoke about earlier, because obviously contractually consideration is going to be needed as to whether there'll be any pooling of the compliance, and if so, how this will interplay with the charterer's obligations under the charter party, particularly in respect of any penalty payments. So the parties will need to consider whether, for example, time charters will get the full benefit of compliance pooling, and if so, how this will work where a charter party doesn't cover a full reporting year. The regulations also allow for the banking and borrowing of compliance, which again, Alexandra spoke to earlier. And once again, consideration will be needed as to how this will be dealt with contractually and whether the time charters will get any benefit or incentive where a compliance surplus is being banked for the following reporting period, but they are not going to be the charterers of the vessel for the full or even part of that reporting period. For passenger and container ships, owners will also need to consider the vessel's readiness for onshore power supply and whether this will have any implications on their obligations under long-term time charter parties should the vessel need to be taken out of service for any modifications to be carried out to the vessel. So obviously, having spoken about some of those contractual considerations, I imagine a lot of questions will be being asked as to what clauses there are that are available in respect of FuelEU Maritime. At present, there's nothing been published yet, but we're aware that BIMCO have two drafting committees which are working on a draft FuelEU Maritime clause for time charter parties and also one for shipmen. As yet, we don't have an estimated timescale in which these will be published, although we understand it may not be until later this year. In the meantime, of course, should members or brokers need any assistance on the contractual side or with draft wording, then please do either reach out, obviously, to your usual FD&D claims handler, or feel free to contact either myself or Helen directly. At North Standard, we also have a decarbonisation expertise team, which has its own email address. So you can always email that address also. And on the next slide, those contact details should be there. So that brings us to the end of the presentation. And I'm now going to pass back to Mark, who will take us into questions. Thanks, Mark.
Thank you very much, Sarah, Helen, Alexandra, and Edwin. Excellent presentations and very interesting. And I think it's generated a little bit of interest amongst the audience with respect to questions. So I'm going to stop the presentation. I'm going to take control. I'm going to stop sharing the presentation, and then we'll all be on the screen. Hopefully. And then I'm going to go to the Q&A. And I think I'm going to start with you, Helen, for the first question in the Q&A. And it's the question from Peter Patterson. Can you see that question okay, Helen?
I can, yes. Thanks, Mark. Yeah, so in terms of the way this will work, it very much depends on the kind of relevant port of call, I suppose, before the EU call. So if there are multiple calls on the way to the EU, it'll be the relevant port of call to start counting the voyage will be the one before any neighbouring transshipment port. So that's how that's going to be dealt with. I'm not aware of there being any pro rata provision. So unless that changes, that isn't in the regulation at the moment. Thank you.
Just while you're on that subject, thanks, Helen. Just while you're on that subject, the definition of a port of call, I think, has come up in the chat somewhere as well. What are the differences between the definition of a port of call in EU ETS and the FuelEU Maritime? Just for the audience, while you're thinking of that.
My understanding is that they're aligned in terms of the definitions. So if your understanding is as per the EU ETS, you'll be getting it right under the FuelEU as well.
Yeah, so it's a port of call where a ship stops to load or unload cargo, embark or disembark passengers, etc., etc.
Yeah.
And then there's exclusions for stops for the sole purposes of refueling, obtaining supplies, relieving crew, and ships going to dry dock, etc., etc. Thank you. Yeah. That's excellent.
Thanks.
I think the next proof of sustainability question, I'm probably going to bounce to either Ruben, Alexandra, or Edwin on the question from on the proof of sustainability. I don't know who wants to stick their hand up for that one. I see Ruben going off mute there.
I can take it, Mark.
Okay, sure. Thanks, Ruben.
Yeah, I understand the concern. So if you, for instance, think of the Netherlands as a member state where we already have what we call the opt-in regime, where you actually can voluntarily generate credits. If you bunker biofuels in a vessel, then you actually have to hand in your proof of sustainability with the Dutch authorities. At the same time, under FuelEU, you will need that documentation to prove that you have bunkered biofuel under FuelEU, right? So we have been in contact with the Dutch ministry in this regards, and they are actually looking into a solution where effectively they will come up with a system, very likely at least, that they can duplicate the POS in such a way that you actually can use it both for the member states targets under RED 3, and now RED 2, and also under FuelEU. So there will be solutions provided by member states.
Thank you. Thanks. Edwin, do you have anything to add from that, from your sort of side of the operation as such?
Yeah, just to say that, I mean, the proof of sustainability is actually required for verification under FuelEU. So there's no kind of way where you in a situation where you don't provide it. So that's why this adjustment, at least under the Dutch state, is very important. We're not aware, though, that this happens anywhere else. I think that this scheme is specific to the Netherlands.
Okay, thank you. And yet again, I'm going to put a question out there. The second question from Andy Taskiris on, could you please provide us with detailed information regarding the profile of companies that are eligible to offer emission pooling services? Does anybody have any more information on that?
I could start and then you could all tell me I'm wrong. But as far as we know, pooling is unregulated by the EU. So if in effect the EU has created an unregulated market, the only requirement for pooling is in the FuelEU regulation, is that you nominate your pool after the year, and the pool must have in total a positive compliance balance. And the pool has a separate verifier, which may be the same as some of the verifiers for the individual ships in that pool, but there will be a verifier that looks after the whole pool. Now, the pool concept in FuelEU is different from the commercial pools that many of you probably are thinking about, which is why it's confusing, because the terminology is the same. but it's not the same. It's a temporary administrative construct just for getting compliance, and the pool changes afterwards because you nominate it again in the following year. So that's and so you can't have a situation, for example, where the pool ends up with a negative compliance balance or anything like that. So what it means that there are entities that are offering help with pooling. They're just being brokers in effect. It's completely unregulated.
Thank you. Thanks. Excellent. And the next question.
I would just, sorry, Mark,
yeah,
I was just going to add in, I think it's really important to emphasize what Edwin was saying, that these pools under the FuelEU Maritime, they can change from year to year. So if you lock in with the upcoming compliance year, if with one pool of vessels, that has to be reconstructed year after year, as the current regulation implies.
Okay, thank you. Some handy practical tips there. Thanks, Alexander and Edwin. The next question in the Q&A anyway is, unless there's any come through in the meantime, is on bunkering doesn't always take place in a European port. What are the provisions for certification outside the EU? I know there is a concentrated focus in this area, but is anybody able to share any more insight on actually what's happening, what the steps are, and what the timelines are for this?
I can go again, unless somebody else wants to jump in and save me. So for now, if you bunker outside of the EU, as long as you get a proof of sustainability that is certified to EU Red, so either ISCC EU or ISCC Plus or the equivalent from RSB, then it is okay. Generally, this works for biofuels. So as long as the certification checks out, has been certified according to the kind of EU schemes, then you'll be able to get a proof of sustainability, and that will be admissible as evidence and proof within FuelEU. Where it's a bit currently a little bit up in the air is to do with e-fuels, where you may have mass balancing. Let's say you have made some e-fuels outside of the EU, and you've taken from the gas grid something, and at the other end, someone's put in some, say, bio-LNG, and your certification is down to mass balancing. That currently does not appear to work in FuelEU, but that's also being worked on. But for now, since we don't have loads of RFNBOs and stuff, so that this is something that's not imminently a problem. But yes, it is. We are aware, or at least the Commission and the EU are aware, and that's being looked at the moment.
Thank you, Edwin. Thank you. There's another question about OPL transshipment and ports of call. I mean, Helen, Sarah, and anybody else in the virtual room may want to correct me on this, but our understanding that it is only measured from one port to another, and the port of call definition was as we discussed before. So OPL transshipment is effectively a form of carbon leakage. So I think basically you would be measuring from the port before until the port after, as far as I'm aware. And hopefully I can see Helen and Sarah nodding their heads at that. So with that, I'll move on to the next question, which is to do with voyage and time charters. And if I could point that at you, please, Sarah. The question from James Warwick, that'd be excellent. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks, Mark. So yeah, obviously, as discussed earlier, there's going to be considerations needing to be had in the context of both time charters and also those voyage charters as well. And in terms of the cost of and compliance with FuelEU Maritime, and from an owner's perspective, obviously wanting to pass on the cost of compliance, be that through the cost of increased cost of fuel, also the kind of the payment of any penalties, how you deal with that in the context of a time charter and a voyage charter. And I take your point in respect of the switching between the two across a reporting period particularly. So I think just like discussed in the presentation, I think it's going to be looking at those charter parties, and certainly from a time charter perspective, looking at the responsibility on charters in respect of the fuel that's being supplied to the vessel, and obviously passing on all of the requisite documentation and data, and also how to deal with any penalties and passing on that cost. In the context of a voyage charter, I think what we might end up seeing is the the cost being passed down by way of an increase in the freight rate, which takes account for the increased fuel costs, or having a clause in there which is kind of a surcharge clause, which might cover off the penalty payments should it be that that's the way that it's chosen that compliance is going to be done. So I think that's going to be what we're going to be seeing. And I think, yeah, it's right that owner members are mindful of this now and thinking about these considerations in all charter party that they're kind of entering into going into 2025.
Thank you, Sarah. And I think you've covered off the question from, please explain which party, owner or charterer is likely to be financially responsible. I think you've covered that off really in your explanation there. Unless you'd like to say anything else on that particular question.
Yeah, I think we just as Helen obviously touched.
Yeah, I think it's been covered off. Yeah, great. And then the next question is respect to carbon factor for different types of biofuels. I think I know the answer to this, but I'm going to pass this to Edwin, Alexandra, and Ruben, because I think they'll have a lot more direct input on this based on their experience.
So Mark, it's the proof of sustainability that will have your carbon factor for your biofuels. In Annex 2 of the regulation, there's a nice table that gives you all the default emission factors and calorific values for your fossil fuels. So that's a really handy table as a point of reference.
Thank you. Yeah. And obviously that's something that you need to focus on in the proof of sustainability, what the actual rating is there, the carbon factor, when compared to the standard table. I suppose it's something that would advise everybody looking at and obviously making sure they're making the right indication there. I'd imagine so.
If I could make a couple of quick comments on that, Mark. So the carbon factor language comes really from the IMO. So the carbon factor is tank to wake. And generally in the FuelEU, we talk about GHG intensity. So carbon factor for MGO is 3.206, and then the GHG intensity of MGO under FuelEU is about 91 point something gram CO2 equivalent per megajoule. So the units are different, just so we're kind of clear about that. Second thing is, Alexander talked about, you have default values that you can calculate from the RED annex. However, generally most biofuels, because the processing method and the feedstock differs somewhat from what we have in there. So in most cases, when you buy biofuel, you get a proof of sustainability, which is an actual value calculation, which is going to be usually better than the default value. And there was a comment about sustainability somewhere in the questions, which I think is worth addressing here. The requirement under RED, and therefore under FuelEU, is that this biofuel has to be somewhere between 50 to 65% better than the fossil fuel comparator. This, in effect, excludes fuel made from food crops. And this is only the sort of much better stuff. And that's generally why we have a lot of waste and used cooking oil, for example, that is eligible under FuelEU, but not the kind of the virgin products or anything like that. So that's the kind of the sustainability requirement that's sort of built into the system.
Just when you talk about that default value there for the GHG, it's 91.90, that's the value. Will that'll be fairly constant for fuels over the next period then, will it, Edwin?
Not to be confusing, but yeah, 91.16 is the value
91.16
against all the reductions every 5 years is put against. But when we talk about the fossil fuel comparator, that's 94. So when you say
94,
it's 65% better than the fossil fuel comparator, it's 94 grams CO2 equivalent per megajoule.
Yeah, and it's the 91.16 is used for the 2% reduction, 6% reduction, and all the way down to the 80% reduction, I believe, by 2050.
Yeah, that's
excellent, right. Excellent. So we'll see that figure banded about a lot more, I think, over the next few years. That's for sure. Excellent. I don't think we've got any more questions in the Q&A or the chat. I think.
Mark, there's just one more that's come in, which I know we're kind of on time, so I'll just briefly touch upon it, but it's about responsibility for compliance, and I think goes to the point of what if you haven't got anything in your charter party in terms of compliance. So yeah, the in terms of the responsibility under the regulation, that's expressed, that doesn't move. So as if you're not the DOC holder, you're not going to be ultimately responsible under the regulation. What we're talking about in the charter party context is how you pass the cost effectively down through the chain and any requirements in terms of the regulation, so document gathering, etc. Where the point 3, can you avoid liability simply by virtue of not having something in the charter party? There is going to be a problem, I think, for owners if there isn't anything express in the charter parties in terms of recovering these costs. But obviously, it's going to depend upon the charter party terms. And I'm sure that if owners find themselves in a situation where there isn't an express clause in the charter party to recover costs, then they will be looking to all the other terms to try and come up with an argument to still pass costs down, to still obtain any information they need in terms of compliance. So definitely from an owner's perspective and from a ship manager's perspective, we would definitely say, look at getting clauses in your charter parties to deal with these where they're going to be spanning into next year. Thanks.
Thank you. Have there been any studies carried out on the effect on the island nations of EU? I'd imagine that's something you might have dealt with, Edwin, if anybody, or have you not come across that?
There are some derogations for the outermost regions and for, I think, some of the islands below 200,000 inhabitants, where there is
200,000, I believe.
Yeah. So there were some very sort of quick estimates as to how many ships would really be taken out of FuelEU while these derogations were in place. But I'm not entirely sure what he means by studies on the effect on the larger islands or no.
Yeah, I have seen that 200,000 figure, and I'm looking for the text. Yes, it's 200,000 residents, PSNO connections between the island and mainland, outermost regions, transshipment ports, ice-class ships and ships navigating in ice are all so the exemptions effectively from that. But yeah, I think
Mark, I would say this is where I think a benefit of pooling comes into play, because there might be some ports, as I suggested in my presentation, ports or bunkering locations where it is harder to access alternative fuels, and thereby accessing a pool is a way of avoiding simply paying the penalty. So I think that this mechanism is one way that I feel like the EU recognizes that not every port has equal access to the cheapest alternative fuels.
Excellent, thank you. Okay, I think we've covered just about everything. Unless anybody can see something that we've not really covered. There's obviously quite a bit of crossover in questions here. So does anybody have anything else they would like to answer? And we're over on time now, slightly by 5 minutes. As we've said before, unless anybody else has any urgent questions, please feel free to contact any one of us. You'll see our emails on the follow-up package. Hopefully within the next 10 days, we will be able to get a